Thanks for joining us. In today's episode, we're going to talk about how to proficiently and effectively use the metacurrencies as a player in 2D20 games. We've already talked about how they function mechanically, but today we're going to give some advice about how you can use them smoothly and use them in ways that really meets the potential that they offer for players during game sessions. Thanks as always for listening. Thank you for joining us. This is our fourth How to 2D20 short episode. And this is actually based on a request or a suggestion from one of our listeners, Crafty Matt. And I appreciate, Crafty Matt, your suggestion because it's a good one, and I hope we do it justice. Matt asked us to talk about not just the nuts and bolts of the rules of metacurrencies, but using them well as players. Not so much as GMs, but using them well as players. So that's what we're going to talk about. How do you use these metacurrencies well within a game session? So quick reminder, if you haven't listened to the one on metacurrencies, go find it and listen to it. But Chris, give us a quick rundown. What are the three main metacurrencies and what do they do? Just as a reminder.
If you look from a player's side, you've got momentum, which you generate from success, from beating the difficulty, getting extra successes, which you can use for various things in combat for other things, and also getting more dice. Threat, you don't use threat, but you can give threat to the GM to buy extra dice. And then the other one depends on the system, but it's, often it's called determination or fortune. Fortune's probably the most likely one, which is like our super currency.
Yeah.
You only get a handful of them. It's very hard to get more, and you might have one or two, whereas, you can generate 1 to 6 momentum on every single check you do. So momentum, you can generate loads of. And
really quickly, if you're coming from the outside, that is, you're not familiar with these things, that which momentum buys you. In other words, like what does 2 momentum buy you? What does 3 momentum buy you? Different kinds of things. The cost for momentum spends and the cost for threat spends for the GM are the same. Or if you give threat to the GM to make up for a lack of momentum for you so that you can spend them, the point totals are exactly the same. And the differentiation between determination and fortune is that fortune typically has no story tie-in for when you spend it. Whereas determination, like in Star Trek Adventures, is supposed to. So Star Trek Adventures uses values, your character has values, and so when you spend a determination, it's supposed to be in relation to a value, like, leave no man behind. Okay, I'm not leaving anyone behind, and so I get to use a determination in this instance, whereas fortune is entirely meta. There is no narrative tie-in. Okay. Groovy. So we have the 3 metacurrencies. Players don't spend threat. They do spend fortune, and they do spend momentum. So how do you approach this mindset-wise? Because this is radically different from, say, inspiration from 5e, which supposedly you have or you don't, which means you can't bank it. You just have it, and you spend it, and then you don't. Or other games where like Bennies and stuff like that. What's the mindset you should approach this with as a player?
All right, let's come to the 2D20 stuff later. I think the easiest thing to get out of the way is the super currency. Okay, because that is more similar. So if you have played something with Bennies or something where you have plot points, whatever they are, that's very similar to our fortune or determination thing. You might start a session with 2. And if you do some amazing role playing or something awesome, you might get another 1. Okay, now let's just work on that base. You've got 2 or 3 of those points for the whole session, and that's all you're going to get. So that actually spending those are very, very simple. When you're doing something which you absolutely have to try and succeed, that's when you spend it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now it doesn't matter if you don't get them back and you run out, because unlike other games, once you run out, you're probably not going to get them out, or you're going to have to jump through hoops to get them back.
Yeah.
There are other ways of getting more dice. Okay, but if you're trying to jump a gap, or you've got to hack a computer or open it, you're doing something super important. Use them. Okay. And then when you're near the end of the session and you're fighting the big bad and you really have to hit the bad guy, that's when you use them. So when you're doing something really, really important. And actually, if you hoard those, it's not the end of the world. Okay. It doesn't really matter. I think the momentum and the threat are the more difficult things to deal with. I think dealing with the super currency, I think is very straightforward. If it's really important, spend it.
Yeah. And I think from a meta standpoint, we all know that most sessions are structured around the idea that you build up to a big climax or crescendo. There will be a big thing that happens nearer to the end of a session. And so if you're staring at your 2 fortune points, you have to think about, well, it would be smart to save one of them for near the end, when I recognize, I can smell the fact that the GM has brought out her giant pile of minis or something like that. I recognize that it's time. So it's probably smart to save one of those. And if all of a sudden you find yourself in a situation earlier in the session where you have to save your bacon, then you use the other one.
Yeah.
So good point. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. That's about as like typical of metacurrency as possible.
Now, obviously, momentum and threat are the different ones. In most other games, you don't have almost an endless supply of these. So let's deal with momentum first. A lot of the time, you're not going to have momentum. Momentum is something you generate. Now, but here's something you can do.
You don't start with it.
Yeah. Momentum is something you can generate really early on. Okay. You can do a task, and this is a bit metagamey, but if you do something and your GM's like, well, that's difficulty 0, do it anyway and roll for it, because if you generate successes more than you need, you generate momentum. Now, in that really momentum breaks down into combat or non-combat. In a non-combat situation, chances are you generate momentum and you haven't got anything to do with it. So you leave it for the next person, but then the next person use that momentum. Because if you don't use the momentum, it disappears slowly over time, like from one scene to the next, it'll just disappear. Yep. Okay, so you use it. So you're running away. It's not a combat thing. Like you're in a car chase or you're hacking a computer. You're doing a stealth thing, something like that. The first person has got no momentum. I'll come back to them later when we do threat. First person makes it well. They generate more successes than they need. So then there's a bunch of momentum. You can't spend it on anything. You succeed. It goes into the group pot. Right. Person number 2. Oh, I need to do a similar stealth check, or I'm climbing up a building, whatever you do. Should I use them? Yes. Just spend the momentum. Okay. Because if you fail, you fail. If you succeed, great. That's what you're trying to do. And if you succeed really well, you generate more momentum and you pay it forward to the next person. And now that first person has kickstarted a chain of everybody else, doing really succeeded because you've got a bunch of momentum.
And go on. Something that's important to remember is that at the end of every action round, one momentum disappears. At the end of every narrative scene, one momentum disappears. So you're right. Momentum is not something that it's like a balloon. I mean, a balloon, no matter how tight you tie the thing, it's going to lose air over time. Like your adrenaline is going to recede. That like flow that you get in when you're with friends, you're on a team or something like that, and everything is clicking. That recedes as the action and the intensity recedes. And so I've had people say, well, that's stupid. Why does it recede? I'm like, well, in reality, like, you know how it is. You get out there. I mean, if you play sports, like you get out there with your friends, you're doing something and it's like you're kicking ass together. And then you get into lulls. Yeah. So the easiest thing to do, and I highly recommend this, and people you got to put 1 and 1 together to get 2 here. If you're looking at a roll and it's like a difficulty 1 and there's 2 momentum in the pool, spend one of them to buy an extra D20, roll 3 D20, and you're more than likely, especially in those low difficulty or lower difficulty tests, you're more likely with more dice to generate more momentum. So you end up like, let's say there were 2 in the pool. You buy a die, you roll 3 dice, boom, you might generate 2 momentum. You use 1, you put it back in the pool. So there's still 2 in the party pool. You have to look at it that way.
Yeah. Now, combat, I think, is a bit different because in combat, there are more things. Out of combat, pretty much the only thing you use momentum for is getting extra dice. So you generate momentum. There's probably not a lot you can do. It depends on the thing. There might be other spends. But
you think about this, like gather information. And I think it depends on the game you're playing. Gather information.
Other than gather information, I would say most things like
things happen faster. An extended task to make something happen. Like in Star Trek Adventures, when you are doing an extended task, you're trying to fix the warp engines before something, bad happens. You can spend momentum to speed up to use less time to accomplish things. So there are things that you can do out of combat that are useful. As in terms of combat, why would you want to spend it?
In combat, it is different because you generate a good roll, and now suddenly let's say you generate 5 momentum. Now, actually, this is the easiest thing that happen. If you generate a ton of momentum, use it on the big things. Some of the big, and if you're good at combat, if you're a rubbishy combat guy, if you generate momentum, leave it in the pot, the next guy's going to get that momentum and they can use it. Okay, so that's straightforward. If you're a really good combat guy and you've generated enough momentum to do something like have a second attack, do it. The second attack might completely trounce some other blocks, so do that. Have the second attack. If you've got the momentum that's going to you hit a second target but you don't make a whole second attack and they take half damage, do it. That's a good spend of momentum. But the easiest one, and the kind of thing you always say to the new players, is if you've done a really good attack and you've generated a bunch of momentum and you're not really sure what to do, then just turn it into extra damage or the reroll, however the damage thing works. It's a nice, easy thing to do. But if you're not sure what to do, then just leave it, because the next player coming along, they can use that momentum to buy extra dice. And we're back to the non-combat thing. Okay, if you've got a pile of momentum in there, should I use it? Yeah. Unless you are genuinely terrible at combat, or you are doing something you're like, well, I don't really think this is worthwhile, but I've got to spend my action. And that shouldn't really be happening in 2D20, because you can attack like, there are ways of doing mental attacks and physical attacks and setting people up and creating truths and so on. It's highly unlikely you are going to be doing nothing useful. If there's momentum there, spend it to improve your roll, because either you're going to do a bigger, more damage in attack, or you're going to do a lot more harm to the bad guy, or you're setting up the next person by generating even more momentum. So actually, it's relatively straightforward. But essentially, momentum you should always be spending. The only reason you shouldn't spend momentum is because if you've just generated a load and the next person to go after you really needs that momentum
and can do something really cool in the moment. Now, here's two thoughts on that. One, as characters, your characters are a team, right? Ideally, they're a team. They know each other. And so we've seen plenty of movies where you watch the team working together and playing off one another's strengths for synergy, and thus also helping to cover for one another's weaknesses. So if you have the egghead, if you have the person who has, in your words, is rubbish in actual like fighting, if that person, you buy some extra dice, you try to generate a bunch of momentum, or at least buy more dice so you're successful, and then just dump it into damage. Or as you said, you leave it for the next person. Here's something also though and it's something that I see it in all my games, that people forget to do. And it's something that when I start running 2D20 again at some point in the near future, like running it regularly, that I will push, is creating traits or creating truths, depending on the game. The norm is that costs 2. After a successful roll, you can spend 2 momentum to create a narrative trait or truth. So, for example, when we talked about we did an episode, the 3rd episode in this how-to series, on what are those things and how they are expressed mechanically, which we don't need to go into now because you can go watch that episode. But I mean, if you're in a room and let's say I'm imagining like the back room of a bar. Could be a fantasy bar, could be science, who cares? Back room of a bar, and there is a mop bucket nearby. You are rubbish in combat, okay? So instead, what you do is you move over there and you kick over the mop bucket, and you say, all right, I'm going to kick that over. The GM says, okay, yeah, you do that. You like evade, you roll to evade someone hitting you with a stick, and you kick the mop bucket over. Okay, great. I'm going to spend the 2 momentum I just generated, or I generated 1 and there's 1 in the pool, or I give you a threat, whatever. You end up spending 2 and you say, I made this giant mess. And so now the floor is slippery because there's soapy water on it between us and our attackers. And then the GM adjudicates that using that trait system to say, okay, it's going to be much harder for them to move. They might slip and fall. And there's a mechanical expression for that. So do not forget, like you said, spend. Spend before the roll, spend after the roll. And if you can't think of anything mechanically to do, think of something narratively, creatively to do, and spend those 2. Which it always has to come on the tail of a successful roll. You can't just spend 2 out of the blue. You have to do something to create that trait, but spend. And that's one of the wonderful things about 2D20 is that it obviously has this strong mechanical base, but has this very clean connection with more anecdotal narrative elements that you can then express mechanically and like put a number to it. So create traits.
Now that leaves us with one metacurrency, which is a player, there's only one thing you do. The only way you can access threat is you want to have extra dice on your roll and you have no momentum.
Or spend really more after the roll.
If you're wanting to doing something, whatever you need the roll for, and you realize, well, I've only got 2 dice. I want more than 2 dice. You look at the momentum pile. There isn't much momentum there, so you can't just use it to spend. Then get threat. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
The thing I want to do is important. I want to succeed. I want to get more dice attacking this bad guy. I want to succeed at this stealth or climbing roll. And you can't do this in other games. Right, I haven't had anything paid to me by the previous player to go, well, it's fine. You just give the GM some threat and you get some extra dice.
Don't worry about it.
Should you do it every time? How important is the thing? If the thing you're doing really doesn't matter at all, then no, probably not. It's probably not worth it. Do you actually need to succeed at the thing you're doing? Then yeah, buy some threat.
Well, and something else to consider too is when you give the GM threat, in a weird way, you are giving a creative challenge to your GM.
Yeah.
And you're saying, here's something. I'm buying money here. I'm borrowing from you, and here's the interest. The interest you will get to play with, but I'm challenging you to come up with something neat, something creative and fun in the moment. Like, get over, and my guess is our listeners are not like this anyway, but like get over the idea of like my character has to win all the time. Like I have to feel validated by my made up character winning all the time. No, you want to have a fun, exciting story. And part of fun and exciting sometimes means you get hit with things that you did not expect. And you're like, whoa, how am I going to work my way around that? So when you give your GM threat, you're challenging them to creatively come back and challenge you, which then ups the ante of the fun, I think, at least.
Yeah, I mean, both either a good GM or pre-written adventures have a bunch of threat spends. Yeah. If you don't buy any threat, if you don't give the GM any threat, they're going to struggle to do the cool, fun stuff they want to do. So just give them the threat.
Yeah.
The game is not meant to be. It's not a competitive game. Okay, and the idea that the GM is going to be against you. We have seen loads of systems where it says be a fan of the players. The GM is going to use that threat to make a bad guy last a bit longer because it's meant to be more epic, or have something cool happen as some kind of complication thing outside of complications. But something cool happen that's fun. I mean, still, the thing that turned me on to 2D20 was playing a beta test for Infinity, where there was a fight going on in a crowd, and the players had generated some threats. I think it's called heat in that, and it meant that like the one cool thing was someone in the crowd got shot. That doesn't happen in other games. It's like maybe on a 1 that happens. Okay. And then you could have like the police turn up, and you could have like a car comes barreling through the thing out of control. That's all suggestions that are in the things. And I can spend my threat doing that. And this was this cool thing. All right, this isn't just here's suggestions of cool stuff that can happen. Here's, if you've got this amount of heat, threat, whatever, as a GM, here's something to spend it on, which makes the fight more interesting. And straight away, it took Infinity from just, it's another cyberpunky sci-fi type game, to this super cinematic, fun thing. Every fight scene was more interesting, and it was more interesting if the players are given GM's threat so they can do cool stuff.
You know what? And every single time, whether it's with my regular players or whether it's at a con or at a game store with strangers, basically, every single time there's that one player who's like, I'm going to keep buying threat. Bar none, it increases the excitement. Like, oh crap, here it comes. Like the excitement goes up. The positive tension at the table goes up because one person's like, yeah, I'll do it. I'll kick in the door. And it never fails to improve the fun in the moment at the table. So spend it, buy it.
There you go. It's part of the game. Don't hoard your resources. There is literally no point at all. Spend that momentum, generate it for someone else for them to use, get that threat and give it to the GM. Okay, spend your super currency. There's no point holding on to any of it. It's not generating you XP or some cool thing at the end.
That's true.
Just spend.
We'll do another episode at some point in the future about that's really GM focused, but this is general and more player focused. I think we got it.
There we go. So
there we go.
Like and subscribe.
Oh yeah, that's right. We have to point down. Go ahead. There you go.
And
you
point
it down.
At random boxes.
Good stuff. All right.